UNC Chapel Hill, a native of North Carolina. His first book was the novel A Visitation of Spirits. That was soon followed by the award-winning short story collection, Let the Dead Bury Their Dead. Since then, he has written a number of books of both fiction and nonfiction, and has won a slew of awards, including an Achievement Award in Literature from North Carolina. He was on faculty here at the U of M from the late 90s until spring of 2002. We miss him and we'd love to hire him back. Please welcome Randall, who's to be interviewed by Joyce Winters Henderson, a fiction MFA student, and Tom Husted, a nonfiction student.
Timms Creek, the North Carolina town in which most of your fiction is set to be modeled on a small town when you were reading. Okay, in the prologue to Walking on Water, you state that the journey across North America discussed in this book is a sojourn into yourself. Do you think that self-exploration is the basis of all writing, especially fiction writing?
No.
No, you don't?
I don't. I think it can be an element in it, but I think that's used as an excuse to abuse the form in your readers too often. I mean, self-expression is good and fine, but if you really need it that bad, you probably should be seeing a therapist. And I think that it happens in magical and indirect ways that you do find out things. I mean, that's sort of a byproduct of it, but it should be art and communication and storytelling and craft. Those should be, I think, those are more important. And self-expression is its own thing. I mean, and I guess I'm also saying, don't subordinate self-expression or self-discovery to a second-tier thing. If that's what you want to do, that's what you need to do, then do that. But don't confuse writing and art with, discovering oneself.
Is there something you've discovered about yourself? By having surprise?
Horrible things. God. Things I wish I had not known. No, I mean, I think you again, the byproduct, you stumble upon things. And most of the things you find, I don't know if it's true for other people, they're not things you went looking for. Some of the mysteries I set out to find are still mysteries, but I found a bushel full of other wonderful goods. But again, they're byproducts. They weren't. I was plowing other fields when I ran across those things.
Well, related to that question, much of your writing reflects or comments on social ills. Okay, A Visitation of Spirits was published at about the same time as a government report citing a high rate of suicide among gay youth. The Fire this time discusses the racial situation of the 21st century. Do you think that the writer has responsibilities to society?
I don't think the writer has a responsibility in the work. I think the writer, if you as an individual feel called to do something socially, then you should. But you shouldn't make your writing a scapegoat. You should ask yourself, do you really want to write agitation propaganda? I recently got roped into talking about James Baldwin and Catherine Stockett, The Help. And Baldwin wrote this rather famous essay which he excoriated both his idol Harry Beecher Stowe and his mentor Richard Wright for writing what he called protest novels, which is another way of saying agitation propaganda. And I think that Stockett, and I think it sort of speaks well of her, The Help is a protest novel too, in a different sort of incarnation. But I think you need to ask, if that's what you want to do, dandy, fine. I'm about something other than that. Alice Walker wrote this wonderful essay, actually I think it was a speech. You can find it in Search of Our Mother's Gardens, where she takes this on directly. And she was very political, she still is. But, and she sort of, I'm echoing what she said in that essay. It's like, if you want to be a political person, fine. But telling stories, creating art, if that's what your goal is, it's not first political. If you are political, it'll find its way through there. But you should be after something much more ethereal and spiritual and nourishing, because politics in a way is pretty ephemeral.
Related in some ways in terms of politics and social issues. I know during your lifetime, during my lifetime, there's been tremendous progress in terms of gay rights in this country and around the world. And I think we would probably agree that much has been gained from that, and that this is in many ways a far better place and time for gay people. On the other side of that, what do you think with all this progress, what do you think has been lost?
Well, it hasn't been a straight line, has it? Who would have thunk that when gays are accepted, gay men and lesbian are accepted in the military, that you'd have states banning, you know, the wonderful euphemism, defense of marriage. Oh my God, it just doesn't even make sense when you say it. What are you defending it against? Are there sort of barbarians at the gate? This jury, anyway, the terminology. So it's never a straight line. It's kind of crooked. The cultural temperature is in a weird place, but I think even though it doesn't move, you know, all the way forward, it goes back, you know, 1 step forward, 3 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, however. But there is some kind of progress. I think, and I was talking about this earlier this summer. I mean, there's certain waves. There was pre-Stonewall. There was a time from Stonewall, all really active 70s, up until the advent of AIDS. And then there's that whole highly politically charged time of ACT UP and Queer Nation and all those things. And then with the advent of protease inhibitors and the Bush administration and world, you know, it sort of morphed into another argument. And I think if you look over the spectrum, there were certain cultural institutions that were relevant to their time, whether it was ways to meet people, ways to disseminate information. A lot of that was dependent on technology. A lot of that was dependent on geography. I mean, New York and San Francisco were sort of really important. So I think it's been decentralized in a powerful way. I think it has become curiously more material. When I was living in New York, I was sort of amazed by how you had all these young men with a lot of disposable income, and the advertisers knew it. And so I think it was corrupted on a lot of levels. The level of communication was corrupted by money and stuff. So I think it has evolved, and it's a really sort of fascinating and complicated, but it's really, there's no comparison to 68 to 2008. I mean, it's really caught a starship.
Do you think that there are insights or experiences that, I mean, for lack of a better term, that older generations have that younger generations may miss out on? Do you think there's significant or sufficient communication intergenerationally?
Well, you know, we were talking about Jason Torres earlier, and I think it'd be instructive to compare Torres to, he's this new writer just graduated from Iowa, and has his first novel, Animals.
We the Animals.
We the Animals. If you compare him to someone like Ed White, or let's say Felice Picasso, or John Ricci, I mean, they're very different set of givens, very different approaches to defining sexuality. But then you have, I mean, again, it's not linear, because Hohenberg just came out with a novel, which is sort of historical in bent. He's been at the forefront of this for quite some time. So the thing I would celebrate is the multitude of voices, and within that multitude are intergenerational voices. So I don't know I think the old dogs probably still have some new tricks to teach. And I don't know how familiar, I'll just leave on this, because it's such a deep literature now. I don't know how familiar the young dogs are with what's gone before, because there was some, John Ricci is just outrageous, and a lot of my students have never heard of him. And a lot of those writers who were writing in the late 60s, who am I thinking about? Terry Southern, you know, all these people, they were madmen. And this seems like a very decorous time compared to those subversive years. So I think there's a lot to be rediscovered.
Related to a question Joyce asked earlier, you know, I'm the social responsibility of the writer or the artist. We've talked a little bit this morning about James Baldwin, and whenever I read Baldwin, I always feel somewhat cheated that he's not, you know, that he's not still alive. I would love to know, you know, what would James Baldwin be thinking about, you know, anything that's going on today. And I think that he really, at some level at least, really cherished like the role of the public intellectual. And you may disagree with that, but I think that's just sort of has the impression I get of him. And I'm wondering, you mentioned in The Fire This Time that we're very, that American culture today is very, very anti-intellectual. Do we have public intellectuals today on the level of James Baldwin? If so, who are they? Direct me.
I think they're still around. And when you first said that, I think, you know, there's so many writers I would love to still have around and sort of, you know, take classes from. But I think they are. I think the climate has changed. We were still producing good writers and good thinkers. I think that the period in which Baldwin was on the stage, they just got more space and were taken more seriously. You had things like the Dick Cavett Show. You had writers on the cover of Time magazine and Newsweek, and I just think it wasn't sound bites and people going on shows hollering at each other and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think alas, poor Hitchens. I think Christopher Hitchens did a very good job. Cornel West, Bell Hooks. I mean, ironically, I think among gay and minority groups, you found more vocal and received voices than in some of the other places. But I think you know, the nation has been producing some wonderful voices, and you know, Vanden Heuvel and all those guys. And Scorvadalis, so he's sort of frail now, but I always enjoyed hearing him as a public intellectual. So I think they're there, but there's just the forums. But the internet has sort of changed things in such a strange way that you can get at these people. Mm-hmm. But it's not like when Jimmy Baldwin was on the cover of Time magazine, that meant something. You know, if you're have you looked, when's the last time you read Time magazine? You can't even remember. You just made my point. I mean, when he published The Fire Next Time, and then it was the only piece in the Newsweek, the New Yorker, and it sold out within a day. I don't think that would happen now. You know, and this they were on a tear. You know, they did the same thing with Truman Capote's book, and it was something else. Because it happened. You know, this was not an unusual thing for a literary sensation to take the nation by storm. I can't think of anything like that happening recently. So it was a different time. But it's not to say that we don't produce people who do that sort of thing. I mean, but work of that quality, but our environment isn't receptive.
There's more effort we have to make the effort more to seek those people out.
Yeah. But they're there.
Because, you know, the political questions I think are really, really interesting. In an interview around the time of Walking on Water, you mentioned that during your research you kept encountering the use of the word we, African Americans referring to themselves as a community, as a we, and determined that, and this is a direct quote from you, black folk in this country as political beings still find a need for a we to exist. I'm wondering if you know, in the last 10 years, if that's changed at all, particularly with the election of our current president, and a related question, whether you think that there's still this need for a we among the gay and lesbian community as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that was my first thing, was to say that, I mean, sort of an anthropological construct that of identity politics that all groups think of themselves as a we. So if it's lesbians, if it's Teamsters, military, the Air Force against the Navy, the Coast Guard, you can easily construct a we, given certain parameters. And I think when you essentialize, I was coming from a place of having essentialized blackness as a child. It was something that was organic and around me. So I had part of that. What that book was defining what that we was. And this country makes it very difficult to define what it means to be black. So that I had to deconstruct and reconstruct that we. As to whether it still exists, I think yes, because a lot of the conditions that force the definition of that we are still in place, despite Barry in the White House, and God bless him. That I think we all got so excited and feverish, 4 years ago, and it was like we thought that things were magically going to change. And then we woke up in March, and it was, darn, we got the same, same day, different problem, same day, same problem, really. So yeah, I think a lot of those things are. I mean, we're moving it forward. I think one of the things, when I published Walking on Water, there were 2 other books. Actually, there were a number. It was like a millennium thing, because there was somebody did. Thomas Dent did a book about traveling around the Civil War sites. But Chediah Foray, I always get is it Foray or Chediah? I always get her name spoonerized. But she did a book called The Color of Our Future, and Lawrence Otis Graham did a book about the black middle class. But I thought, when I saw Chediah's book, I was like, oh, she's really onto something here. Because she was looking at the changing demographic and all of these young people who were biracial. She was looking at the identity politics that were not dual, black and white, but Asian, Latin, and all that. It's like, y'all, this is, the coming wave is about pluralism. It's not going to be anymore about black versus white. It's going to be, how do we deal with all these folk? And it gets really complicated. So I think that is, we becomes even more problematic when you sort of bust it open like that. So, I mean, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be exciting.
You think economic reality would be a part of that program?
Yeah. I mean, because one of the things, communism has become such a dirty word. And it held so much currency going back to really around the time of World War I and before that. And you had all of these artists talking about agitation, propaganda, black writers in particular. I mean, Wright and Ellison sort of bought into it thoroughly. And their whole idea was to melt identity as we think of it. And you're a worker. That's the we there. So I think we have managed to decouple economics from the discussion a great deal, but it is a bedrock still of a lot of what we need to deal with.
Okay, your first 2 books were a collection of short stories and a novel. You did several nonfiction works, and last night again you were reading from a fiction work in progress. I was going to ask, how do you shift from writing fiction to nonfiction, and vice versa? How do you make that shift? And what are the major differences in the process of writing fiction and nonfiction?
Well, I have two answers really. One is that it's always about the prose. It's always about the sentence, and you want to. I mean, the writers I admire, achieve a certain level of excellence, regardless whether they're telling the truth or lies or a mixture thereof. But they let the lies get in the way of the truth, or the truth get in the way of the lie. And then it's paying attention to the demands of the form. Because if it's fiction, you're going to be looking at the voice. If it's nonfiction, you're going to be looking at the proper representation of the subject. So in many ways, it's coming at it in different ways. And I love the new journalism of the, it really goes back to the 50s, but one of my countrymen, Joseph Mitchell, he wasn't really a new journalist, but I put him in that because his spirit was. But the time you get to the 60s, the Tom Wolfes and the Norman Mailers and the Joan Didions and those sort of things, and they approach nonfiction with the same bag of tools that a fiction writer did, and someone like Mailer did them both. So it's not that hard for me to hit that toggle switch in my mind, and sometimes it doesn't, because I'm actually pretty much a hard ass when it comes to facts. And I really get up in arms when people say, when you write memoir, you don't have to, you can just fudge, honey. No, you can't. You a liar. And God don't like it. God's gonna beat you down. So I don't believe in massaging facts, but I think that your prose can still be engaged and used effectively.
Is there a major difference for you then in writing short stories and writing novels?
Oh, that's a horse of a different color, and that's the difference between. You can't even say the difference between an appetizer and a full course because I think they're different forms altogether. Because I think short fiction is closer to poetry in many ways, and a novel is it's more like kind of like building a house. You gotta get the plumbing and the electrical and the roof, and it's just a whole different type of construction. Whereas poetry is, a short story you can do in a sustained burst. You can't do that with a novel. You can do it maybe with a short novel, but I don't think it's been done well that often. So I think it's you're playing with different stories. I think writers like, she's so prolific, she probably does. I'm thinking of Alice Munro. That they seem so, she probably thinks about them a lot before she sits down. But I think that they're different. Not just, obviously they're different forms, but it's not just a matter of short versus long. I think that, and you can achieve something in a short story that is different from what you get in a novel. And maybe you can find a part of a novel that does that, but a novel's project is entirely different from a short story.
So do you find a major difference in your character development between the short and the long?
No, well, I come from that old school where I don't want to say recycle characters, but I revisit characters a lot. So I'm not going to let them alone. I dig them up if they're dead even. I just worry them to death. So I think a good character deserves revisiting, and the masters taught us that. That's nothing I came up with. But yeah, but again, there's something like in poetry. I was teaching. There's a Heather Ross Miller poem that's a conversation with Lita the Swan. I think Lita speaks back, something like that. None of my young'uns knew Gates. Isn't that a shame? So I had to go. First, we had to go talk about Greek mythology and Zeus and what a pimp he was, and who Clytemnestra and Helen were, and all that, so they could understand Yeats. And then we talk about Heather Ross Miller. So I think there's a compression, and you probably put poetry and short stories ask more work of you. I love teaching. Welty's A Worn Path. It's sort of been taught to death, hasn't it? I'm sorry. I'll stop teaching it. I'll move on to Lily Dog. But Phoenix Jackson. There's not a. She's creating more around negative space than knowing a lot about. Welty could do that. She could tell you, Delta Wedden is an exhaustive amount of information about her characters. But again, a second short story uses negative space more than. In the similar way to poetry.
The work in progress you read from last night sounds almost to me like a different voice from your earlier work, your earlier fiction works, even though it has a lot of the same strengths to me.
Well, thank you.
Do Do you think that your fiction writing process has changed? You didn't voice has developed in this time?
I mean, with this thing, I kept vacillating. I knew the story I knew I wanted to tell needed a lot of latitude and distance, and it's covering a huge amount of time, some of it going back to the 19th century. So the question for me was, do I use an omniscient voice, or do I do that American standback, which I just love it so much. And I think because I love it so much, I was avoiding it until I just, gave it up to Jesus and said, here I am, Lord. But the first person omniscient, and it's Moby Dick, it's All the King's Men, it's Great Gatsby, it's Willa Cather's Lost Lady. I mean, Americans know how to do that. We know NASCAR, we know high fructose corn syrup, jazz, first person. So it took me a while to embrace it. Because I kept going back to Les Miserables. Victor Hugo was just so good. It was amazing. But maybe I'm just not old enough or smart enough to do that omniscient. It's something very in Middlemarch. It's something very arrogant about just being God, and I just wasn't ready to do that. But I struggled with it. I tried, but now, it's definitely a first person. I mean, first person who knows everything, probably more than he should. Well, thank you.
Now you said that a good writer, to be a good writer, one must be a good reader. Okay, so what do you mean now? Is there anyone that you recommend?
Oh, well, I was reading for pleasure. I mean, we had brought Susan Orleans here when I was here, and which is a memorable thing. And she has a new book about Rin Tin Tin, which is great fun. I didn't know anything about the dog. The 10 dogs. There were a lot of Rin Tin Tin. I'm reading. I just got the Jeffrey Eugenides. I haven't read it yet. There's a book of stories. I've read this before, but I'd recommend it highly. Susan Fallon's "You Know When the Men Are Gone." Do you guys know that? Oh, she was at Fort. She was a military wife. She was based at Fort Hood. She was there when the killings happened. And these are. Has anyone read it? Do you know the story? It's these stories about, from the point of view of women. Actually, a few are from the point of view of men. But during this long war, being at home, it's just really. I was surprised it wasn't nominated. I'm starting Jess Ward's new book, Jessamine Ward, who was nominated for the National Book Award, set down in New Orleans. And a book. I'm obsessed with the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance for some reason. This book, that Da Vinci, Machiavelli, and Roderigo all lived at the same time. Pope, the Bishop of Rome, all lived at the same time. Florence, sorry. His father was the Pope. And this book speculates on whether or not they met. They probably did meet at some point. I mean, certainly they met one, but if all three of them were ever in the same room together. And it's a fascinating book. I tried to think, I can't remember. I was thinking this morning, I meant to look it up on my iPhone. It was only published a few years back, so it's a fairly old book.
It is 11:10 if anybody has a class at 11:20.
You describe yourself as a last comic book collector.
I'm not. I can say that with impunity.
Okay, so what do you think of the future of graphic novels in this genre?
It's so funny. The reason I couldn't come, because when you asked originally, I was going to come for the weekend. But I had a previous thing that I had forgotten about, which was I was at the North Carolina Comic Con. I was on a panel of academics talking about comic books as literature. And so I felt very much in my I think it's going well. I mean, I think, again, like with short stories, I think it's a different form. I think that people who haven't read it and have contempt for it think it's just pictures with stories. I mean, stories with pictures. And it's more than that. I mean, it's actually stories. It's like movies, the visual stuff is storytelling. So I think we're moving forward. I think there's a danger, as with so much stuff, of it being crassly commercialized. And I mean, there's a big hubbub because DC has rebooted its entire universe. They started their characters all over again, that sort of thing. But I'm still sanguine about it. I mean, I don't have as much time for it now as I did once upon a time. But I think as a form, it still has lots of possibilities. And I'm happy to see. I mean, I think it's overwrought. People thinking that it's going to be accepted in the academy, you know, on par with Faulkner and Hemingway and, you know, Virginia Woolf. That day is a few decades off, you know? So they don't have to get too worried about it. But I think there's enough younger scholars who do take it seriously that it will be, and in enough places it's being, you know, sort of practiced seriously that it will. And then there's just the influence of Asia, because they don't have the hang up that we do about it, and they have taken great strides and have influenced the West. So I think it's exciting.
So really shifting gears, sort of back to James Baldwin a bit. So a process question. So you edited a recent collection of Baldwin's uncollected essays and some. So there were a few previously published letters in there, and various other pieces. I'm curious to know, first off, how you became involved in that project, and then wondering if you can walk us through the process of assembling that book. You know, as a longtime fan of Baldwin, and what was that like for you?
Oh, it was wonderful. It wasn't much in terms of actually doing the research, because David Lehman had done that before. David Lehman, who was his authorized biographer and who had worked for Baldwin, and so he did the biography. And maybe even Baldwin and his family had a list of his stuff, but in either case, so the stuff was found. So the estate contacted me after pretty much everything had been gathered, and asked me if I would like to, you know, organize it and write about it. So that was really the bulk of my involvement. But I had Gloria Smart Baldwin, who was the literary executive. I had done a keynote address in Baltimore, and I met her there. So I guess we struck up a relationship. But yeah, she asked me to do it.
How long did that process take?
Not that long, because again, the material was already there, so it was just a matter of me reading everything and coming up with a schema. Because it would be really lazy just to do everything chronologically, and some people suggested that was the proper way to do it. That'd be boring. It's just lazy.
As an admirer of James Baldwin, what do you think that you in particular brought to that project?
The spirit of fiction and nonfiction, and the puzzlement over the place of Protestantism. He wrote this essay that it's one of my favorite things, and it's fairly obscure. It said, "Nobody Knows My Name," and Esquire sends him to interview the great Swedish director Ingmar Bergman. This piece called "The Northern Protestant," and it's odd because I had felt this when I watched Bergman too, but he and Bergman strike it off, and it's over Protestant. It's first their relationship with their fathers. They had very stern fathers, but also Protestantism, and you know, Sweden is a pretty Protestant country, and Baldwin had grown up in the Protestant Holy Roman Church, and he'd been a child minister. And so there's something, same for me. So I think that's a core in his work. His time spent as a youth minister really stamped his just prose style and what lies underneath his attitudes toward humanity, toward racial injustice, and on. And I think that aside from the obvious, the black gay thing, that I am much more interested in that resonance than anything else.
So that's what you brought to the table. What do you think you took away from that for being involved in that?
Well, every time someone asked me, because I also did a biographical essay for the Oxford historical thing. I did a kid's book. I did the homage. So I was like, Jim, ain't you tired of me coming sniffing around? Yeah, just rediscovering how good he was. I was so thrilled. There's one piece in there. He writes about the fight of the century. How many fights of the century? Where could there be? I'm so sorry about it. Joe Frazier. Yeah, that's so sad. But he wrote about Floyd Patterson and Sonny Robinson, their fight, and it's a good piece of writing. It's a good example of new journalism, which he was in that crowd, and I think people forget that he was. And just as a historical document, I mean, you forget when Cassius Clay was. Remember, he was Cassius Clay then. He was hanging around there, and did you know that when he first took a Muslim name, it was Cassius X. I love it. Not only 2 weeks. So yeah, rediscovering all that good stuff.
In your introduction to Crossing Redemption, you likened Baldwin's prose to the work of Miles Davis, and you wrote that his skill allowed him to go any place he wanted with deceptive ease, like magic. What if you were to compare yourself to a musician, who would that musician be? Or are there musicians that you would classify as influences on your own work?
I wish I had the arrogance to say Miles Davis. Wouldn't that be sweet? You can hear, Do you know that Kind of Blues was the best-selling jazz album of all time? It's like, and you hear it all the time. You don't even know it. You hear it's like background. It's amazing how it influenced. I thought about this, and I think it would be Cyrus Chestnut. You guys know Cyrus, jazz pianist? And for similar things to what you're talking about with Baldwin, he quotes, jazz musicians quote. He has this. He was brought up Pentecostal, and that's a huge part of his vocabulary. And he actually did an Elvis album. Cyrus Chestnut. He's a wonderful. He did this. I think it's called Elvis. And he does all these songs, but you've never heard Hound Dog until you hear him. It's Hound Dog, and it sounds like a church hymn. he's bad. I mean, bad is in the Michael Jackson bad. But yeah, that versatility, that melding of. That's my choice.
All right.
Also, I mean, if I was going to cheat and say a singer, because Cassandra Wilson,
okay,
we're about the same age, and her first 3 albums I've heard that's what I want to do. New Moon Daughter, and anyway,
Okay, so do you still consider yourself to be essentially a Southern writer? And do you think that in these days of globalization, Southern writing remains something distinct from American writing in general?
I'm not even an American exceptionalist, and I don't understand why this has become such a big thing. No, I don't run away from it. I don't, I embrace it, but at the same time, I don't think that's all I am. It never occurred to me. I remember I wrote, Dorothy Allison and I were really good friends, and I was reviewing for The Nation. I reviewed Bastard Out of Carolina, And I'll never forget, because I wrote this glowing review and my editor said, nah, baby, this is just a little, you have to find something critical. So I put one thing in there. I said that Uncle Earl comes off a little like stereotype, something like that. I just didn't please my editor. And so a few years later, the New York Times Magazine does a profile of Dorothy. And in the middle of the article, this is quote from me, the only bad thing I said. But they introduced me and said, Randall Kenan, the gay black southern. How about, ain't that a shame? Has Jonathan Francis' name ever been preceded by the straight, white, Midwestern? I mean, so if you haul all that stuff around on your back, you're going to be stooped over directly. So I just dwell in it, and it comes and it goes, but I mean, I think of it more as of a legacy than as a cage. And I think that putting all that stuff in front would. So I never think about it as something I have to either live up to, or that I even have to deal with. If I want to write science fiction about blue people, then damn it, that's what I'm going to do. But yeah, it's more of a part of who you are as opposed to, I'm putting on my super cape of southernness now, which would look pretty cool. I see a bottle tree on the back. Thank you.
Randall, you've got a lot of magical material in your stories. There's folklore, there's magical realism, there's songs, there's everything from nursery rhymes to quotes from Al Green. And as an amateur folklorist myself, I'm wondering, where did you find this stuff? Was it just all around you when you were growing up? Was it a Kenan family tradition just to know bits and pieces of folklore, and did you absorb it that way, or did you formalize your study of it?
It was both. It was both. I mean, it was, and it was reinforcing. I mean, some of it you grew up with, and I grew up, and I couldn't wait to get out of there when I was growing up in there. But when you leave it, you realize what a rare thing it was. It wasn't rare, as rare then as it is now, but it was already becoming increasingly rare that you would have. I grew up by people who were born in the 19th century, and so yeah, there was a lot of orality, a lot of storytelling, a lot of things I took for granted, and so going away was essential to learning to appreciate that, and then building on it and learning more. So yeah, it goes hand in hand.
Do you still study it, books of folklore?
Oh gosh, yes. Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, it's endless. It's never ending. It's like music. You can never stop.
So what you read last night, you said at the beginning that you weren't in any hurry to finish it.
It's true.
You think we can do to motivate that?
Well, I guess it's something I have to work out personally. Is like when it's done, it's done. I was tickled to see that Matheson came back and he did this trilogy, and a few years ago he came back and sort of gussied it up and put it together. So I guess you could do, but that doesn't happen a lot. And so you just want to do it to my satisfaction, and I like hanging out with the characters. That's why I say I have no anxiety about publishing.
So we should want you to.
Well, no, it's very encouraging. It's very encouraging, and it's probably something kind of perverse on my part that I but yeah, I should. My agent is very unhappy with me. She punched me the last time I saw her. Luckily, she's not a big woman. So. She just hit me. But it's good that someone wants. So, yeah, I hope I'm sure. I hope you weren't disappointed.
So do you think that those characters And might be another work later on, the 10 street characters?
Some of them, undoubtedly. I've already planned one book for relatively, she's not minor, but I couldn't let her go. She's going to be, and then some are from earlier things.
Do you find that people from, it's Chinquapin, is that
Chinquapin.
When Thomas Wolfe wrote Look Homeward Angel, he had the experience of people who wanted to be in the book and they were disappointed not to find themselves. They were mad at the way he was depicted, or any of your characterizations close enough or based enough on single real individuals that there were reactions like that in this book, or are they more composites?
I mean, there were two characters from the first book, and they're actually in here, but people don't realize it because I don't read it, who were obviously modeled. I mean, I think they got away from that, but I think they were so iconic that it was obvious who they were for people who grew up in the community. But with this one, I thought I was very clever in hiding anything, but I'd be darned if not only did people recognize themselves in characters I had no intention. It was all good. No one ever came up and hit me with a frying pan or anything. But this was what really spooked me. The occult and supernatural stuff people started talking about as if it exists. I made this stuff up. I don't know what you're talking about. And that was very frightening because I didn't know if I had just known something and forgotten about it, or if they were just, this is all my suggestion. And I'm like, no, that did not happen. Stop it. I remember when that boy did that. I was like, no, you did not. It never happened. That's all right. So yeah, it's interesting. And I think the bad things they just completely ignore, which is so refreshing. I just think we're good Baptist people, and we just avoid confrontation. We just say, pray for you and bring you potato salad.